Hello and welcome to Unprecedented, a podcast about technology, finance, and the future of law. I'm Ben Hancock, a journalist for Law.com in San Francisco, and this week we're talking about Bitcoin, token offerings, and regulation. There's been a lot of light and heat in this space over the past several weeks. My guest is here to help us make sense of the emerging debate around token presales, recent SEC enforcement action, and Switzerland's crypto valley. I'm speaking today with Joshua Klayman, who is of counsel in the Financial Transactions Group and is a founding member and the head of Morrison & Foerster's Blockchain and Smart Contracts Group. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. So, Josh, I feel like since we're talking about blockchain and cryptocurrency, I can't get away from at least asking you about Bitcoin, and this may be old news by the time that this podcast goes out, but this morning the price is like surging past $17,000 per coin. You advise people in the financial industry. I just wanted to ask whether this is something that matters to clients on your side of things.
Sure. So before I answer that, I just want to say just my usual disclaimer, which is nothing that I say is legal advice, nothing that I say is investment advice, and everything that I say is just my own personal view and doesn't necessarily reflect the view of my employer or anyone else, frankly.
Got it. Duly noted.
So in response to your question, yes. I think the price matters of Bitcoin right now to a whole host of folks. Everyone from large financial institutions to hedge funds to, frankly, my siblings and in-laws and others. So I think everybody has really, to the extent that they may not have been paying attention before, they certainly are paying attention now.
Right. I want to ask, one of the things I want to touch on in this conversation is the issue of regulatory scrutiny, not only of cryptocurrencies, but of digital tokens and ICOs. Is Bitcoin and these kind of digital currencies, I know there's kind of a debate within the Bitcoin community about whether this is a currency or a store of value. Leaving that aside for now, is this something that you get the sense regulators are paying attention to, and if so, how? You mean to
Bitcoin in particular, or digital currencies and tokens in general?
To Bitcoin in particular.
So I think yes. I think it would be very difficult for them not to see all of the comments that are being made in the media, all of the price increases that we've seen lately, all of the new accounts opening that have been announced at different exchanges. I definitely think that regulators of all sorts are looking at Bitcoin and, frankly, other cryptocurrencies and other digital tokens. I don't think, however, that all of the, sometimes we think of regulators and we think of, oh no, regulators are paying attention. This means something challenging. They're going to shut us down or something like that. I think it's, right now, the sense that I get is, yes, regulators, they have a stated goal of protecting members of the public and others, right? But at the same time, I'm not seeing that regulators want to shut down innovation here. I think we've actually seen some signs of the opposite, which is, for example, now, we're going to be seeing Bitcoin futures. We are, there have been bills proposed that relate to certain tax exemptions potentially for a de minimis amount of Bitcoin holding. Now that hasn't gone through, and these are just proposals.
Right,
and let me just say here, I am not a tax lawyer, so don't ever follow my tax advice about anything. But I think what we're seeing is a focus on it, but a focus of trying to understand it and trying to figure out how the existing regulatory frameworks apply.
Got it. So Josh, I saw you speak, I think it was last week, at the Berkeley Law ICO and blockchain conference, and one of the topics that was talked about a lot there was this issue of token pre-sales and how that factors into ICOs and the regulatory framework. For listeners who aren't as familiar, and I'm certainly still learning about this space, about what an ICO is and what a token presale is, can you give us a quick overview?
Sure. And for some who are listening to this may be a complete review, and you may say, hey, that's not nearly technical enough, but I think there are enough people who probably need a more basic description of it that it might be helpful just to kind of give the basics. So let's assume that that the people listening have a background knowledge of blockchain and a basic knowledge of smart contracts. I want to talk for a moment about digital tokens. And I'm going to say this, and this applies also to other terminology that is typically used. So before I go into exactly what is a token sale or an ICO and what exactly is a pre-sale, I think it's important to talk about the tokens for a second. So the reason, some people are like, well, of course, they may say, we think all tokens are securities. And then others will say, no, we don't think that. And then some will say, well, all of these token sales have been sales of securities, and others will say, no, we don't think that. The reason that there is this variability in views is that there is no monolithic token. So there is no one view. So if you think about a token rather than as a coin or a representation of a coin or something like that, if you think of it rather as a string of numbers on a digital distributed ledger. So if you think of it more of like a credit card number or something like that,
right,
it's a lot more helpful because that's at base what each token is, just a string of numbers. So you can ascribe whatever values and characteristics to that token as you want. You can make it look just like a traditional security. You can make it look like a hybrid. You could give it profit rights. You could give it certain voting rights. You could make it look like debt. You could do all sorts of things. You can do that. You could also make it look, hey, just as a membership token. So by holding this token and using it, you can enter into a certain token ecosystem, or you can use it in a way that makes it look much more like a license to use software. You could have tokens that simply are data points in a larger data set. So not every token is the same, and that's an important thing to remember while we're discussing some of the things that have come up and some of the regulatory focus and how and why these questions about pre-sales and whether something is a security and what laws will apply, why it matters. So another thing I just want to address quickly is this idea. I was recently asked, what is the difference between a token and a cryptocurrency?
Good question.
And cryptocurrencies are digital tokens. So digital tokens is basically a generic term for it. So you might have, sometimes people will say, well, Bitcoin, we're calling that a digital currency. Or say Ether, we're calling that a digital currency. There are different views, perhaps there are some others that people might view as a digital currency. But those are still digital tokens. So when we say that, this is getting back again to the idea about some tokens not necessarily being securities. Some tokens might be commodities. There are all kinds of regulatory schemes and frameworks that may apply. And that's just in the U.S. Of course, across the world, there are other frameworks as well.
Right.
So why this matters, and getting into what is an ICO or what is a token sale, as I more frequently call it, and some people frequently call them also token generation events. There's a whole cottage industry of coming up with terms of what to call these things.
Or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, the thing about tokens that makes them different is this flexibility. So we all know what it looks like when you issue equity. There are a few different flavors you could have. What it looks like when we issue debt. Mm-hmm. For early stage companies, there are a few reasons, and actually I'm sure there are many reasons why they might want to issue tokens as opposed to, or sell tokens as opposed to issuing shares or taking on debt or something like that. If you think about a token and the things that we just talked about, in some ways it's a sale of software. And that could be used, I'm going to phrase this a certain way, but I want to just make clear I'm just doing this for illustrative purposes. I'm not trying to suggest in any way that all token sellers are trying to do this to sell for this purpose.
Right. It's not universal. It's hard to generalize in this space.
Right. And so if you look at some early stage companies, and certainly we are seeing token sales now out of more mature companies, and even certain very large companies are contemplating the ideas of token sales. But just holding that aside and thinking about early stage companies, in the past there were fewer options for how these token sellers might get funding for developing their business. So, for example, traditional VC investments of equity and similar convertible debt, things like that. These things, when you think about, and I'll give an example that I kind of like to use. I love the show Shark Tank. And I am that annoying person in my home who, when somebody makes a deal, I'm very excited for them, but then I always, as they're going off stage, I kind of nudge the people in my house and I say, hey, that's not the end of the line. Like, now they have to negotiate this, they're going to give up control for this, and who knows what else. And, so this is just the beginning. This is kind of like a proposal or something like that. And it's definitely, there are a lot of things that need to be worked through. So there are some drawbacks, to issuing equity. Founders typically, they may need to give up aspects of control. They may need to give up certain economic interests, lots of different things to give up. There may need to be kind of bespoke negotiated documents that are done. You may have side letters,
right.
Different
it gets complicated.
Things. Right. And it can take a lot of time, and usually it is, at least in the past, it's been the same types of individuals who are getting in at this early stage. So the idea, now holding aside the idea of pre-sales, which we'll get to in a minute, one of the great things about token sales is whether so one reason you could be doing a token sale would be potentially to raise money, okay? So that's not necessarily a bad goal. You may end up with a token that looks more like a security in certain circumstances, but just for purposes of this discussion, just say you are trying to raise money for a minute, okay? For that, let's see, you can structure the token so you don't have to give up control, so you don't have to give up economic interests. You can structure it however you want. So
right.
for a
It's
founder,
a lot more flexible.
Yeah, and guess what? All these people are going to be purchasing it pursuant to a smart contract. That's not going to be negotiated. You're basically setting forth terms and conditions, and people can choose to purchase or not. These are not negotiated smart contracts.
Yeah, so you can see why it's
right?
in the interest of the company or the founders or whoever's developing the blockchain software.
Right, and potentially you may have a much broader swath of people who can get involved, and many of whom may be, true believers in what you're trying to build. So if you're trying to, have a token ecosystem, and this is going to partially help fund the development of it, as well as provide, the tokens provide access to it, that can be great because you're kind of, you're bringing in a whole another group of people who may actually want to use your token and use your ecosystem and help it develop.
Right, so you're creating a market at the same time.
Right, yes, and also this, I want to just be careful here and say, some founders, they may actually have an ecosystem and they may not be doing it necessarily with a view to selling these for investment. There could be, we sometimes talk about utility tokens versus security tokens, and while there are no bright line rules for this, as the SEC has made clear, there certainly are circumstances where just like if you went, to give an example, if you went into an arcade, a video game arcade, and the only way you could play these video games was to basically, put your dollar in the machine. I don't know if you've ever been to one of these arcades, but I used to go all the time when I was younger. And then you get your little fake gold tokens out, right? And you put them in the machines, and you can also think of it that way, and sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes it literally is just access to play the games, to play the machines, to enter the ecosystem and to take part in it. So I just want to be careful that in my example of, alternatives to early stage funding, that I'm not kind of giving a view that suggests that all token sellers are doing that, or that all token sellers are even early stage.
Right.
So now moving past that, there is a question. So that token sale that I kind of described, it presumes that it's open to anyone, unless you were to restrict certain countries, or say you're fearful that you might have a token that was a security and you didn't want it to be, and you just wanted to guard against certain things, and you didn't want to do a fully registered offering. You might restrict who could participate, so that you're only marketing, issuing, selling in U.S. to U.S. accredited investors or something like that, availing yourself of one of the more common exemptions to registration. But just let's assume for a moment that the token sale is open to anyone. Sometimes founders and others may be in a position where they may want to take in money before that larger token sale to kind of bridge their ability to get to that token sale.
Yeah.
And so,
walk me through that. So why would you want to do that? I can imagine some technical reasons. You need to kind of have the seed money to do your development. But what are some of the examples you've seen?
Well, I mean, I think it runs the gamut. Certainly, there are some early stage companies that don't have a lot of capital, and so they may say, "Hey, I want to sell some of these to more of the traditional investor base that would have typically provided venture capital funding, or others, other individuals,
VCs,
accredited investors, yeah, yes, and that way, imagine, I started up a company and I'm going to do a token sale, but I don't have enough money to pay, say, lawyers or others, or
important costs.
Yeah, because many of these things, and I'm kind of joking, obviously, about lawyers, but I think a key part of doing a compliant token sale is having a good team, and that, of course, includes a legal team, but it also includes a lot of others within this space who can really help you out. So, for example, doing KYC and AML checks, that's very important, among other things.
And for those who don't know the acronyms, KYC and AML.
Oh, know your customer and anti-money laundering.
There we go, yeah.
Apologies for that. Yeah, so basically, concerns about money laundering, terrorist financing, things like that, these are important. There's a lot more. We focus so much time and energy on thinking about whether the token's a security, that sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact that there are many other regulatory frameworks too. There are commodities laws, there are tax laws, there are money transmitter laws, there are investment company, investment advisor, broker-dealer, all kinds of other things that you need to take into account. So not only, I guess, touching on that for a second, so obviously it's going to be, you have your legal team, but even just for the small slice of how are you going to make sure that your purchasers of your tokens, that they are not somehow money launderers or something like that, so they comply with that. Very often, if you can imagine, if you are a new token seller, a new early stage company, are you really going to be able to independently do that kind of a check? Well, possibly, most likely not. And so for that reason, when I'm talking about teams, there are companies that will help token sellers to do KYC AML checks. There are companies that will help token sellers to audit their smart contracts, to closely analyze their white papers from a technical perspective, to do a whole host of things, as well as marketing. Marketing the token sale in a way that, if they don't want it to be a security, and if the characteristics of the token may make it less likely to be a security, making sure that the marketing is done in a way that is consistent with the idea of it being not a security.
Right.
So that you don't somehow be in a position where you make it look more like a security merely by the way that you're talking about this. So there are a lot of different players, and so that also goes into the idea of why someone might want to pre-sell some of the tokens.
Right.
Just to have capital for that. And also, to the extent that you may be still building the platform or doing things like that, there may be there may be technical things as well that you need to fund. So sometimes people are able to provide pre-sale funding, which in some cases you may structure to look more like the pre-sale of software, right, or something like that. But in other cases, some people literally are doing it for investment purposes. So there are different approaches. Now, I'll kind of unpack that in a second.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about the SAFT debate a little bit, but I'll let you carry on here first.
Oh, sure. Well, and I guess I can segue into that. Anyway.
Yeah. So I guess I'll ask the question. I mean, this was something that I was unfamiliar with when I went to the panel at Berkeley last week. And for those listening, SAFT stands for Simple Agreement for Future Tokens. It's a riff off of SAFE, which was an innovation back in, I think, 2015 out of the Silicon Valley legal community. So Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And this is an idea that was put together by some folks at Cooley and Protocol Labs. They put out a white paper at the end of October. But this has stirred some debate, some controversy. And Josh, I think you yourself signed on and helped contribute to a paper from the Cardozo Law School that kind of raised some red flags about why this framework might be a little risky. So, yeah, if you could unpack, a little bit of what the SAFT is and then some of your concerns about it. I'd love to hear that.
Sure. So the SAFT white paper was put forth by another firm, and as well as some others as well. And it was put forth by, let me just say this, by reputable people
right.
whom I have great respect for. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not in any way by being critical of some of the thoughts in it. In no way am I suggesting that there is a lack of competence or anything like that.
Right.
Just there are different views. So one thing that I think is important to preface this with is when that white paper was presented, my understanding is that it was presented as a proposal. You end up in this situation where and to go through this, I need to frame it slightly, if that's okay.
Of course.
Of what people are trying to solve for. So the Dow enforcement action, which came out this summer,
by the SEC,
focused on that troubled situation with the Dow, which already had its own problems previously with the smart contract vulnerability, and then led to a hard fork of Ethereum. So
right.
It's having a lot of problems long before the SEC focused on it. But they basically said, listen, we took a look at this, and the Dow token was a security. They were creating a virtual venture fund. It looks like a security. They were selling to U.S. persons, and notwithstanding that they launched the token sales from Switzerland, U.S. securities laws still apply because they marketed, issued, and sold to U.S. persons. They also went beyond that, though, to say that every token, that because the Dow token was a security, that the platform on which the token was sold was an exchange and likely should have registered as a national securities exchange or as an ATS or availed itself of some exemption from registration as a national securities exchange. So I'm leaving that there for a second. The Dow report also said some other things, including that it wasn't analyzing under Investment Company and Investment Advisor Act whether those would apply. But just what people are trying to solve for in some cases is that they don't want their token to be deemed to be a security.
Right.
So you're in this position where you want to be selling something and emphasizing the consumptive value of a token, right, so that you may not be potentially issuing a token that's a security. We'll just say you want to issue a quote-unquote utility token. But utility isn't enough. You have to make sure that it kind of fits. There's a test called the Howey test. I won't get into it here, but it's not a bright line test. It basically says you take into account a number of facts and circumstances,
Right.
and then you apply it against the law.
I just have to say, as a non-lawyer, the idea that the test is, well, you look at the facts and circumstances is like a totally vague, really big idea. It doesn't. I can understand why a lot of people who are not lawyers getting into this space really don't have any idea where the lines are.
Right, and I mean, we do have guidance that says, okay, what does the value say? It says like an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profit based, solely or primarily on the efforts of others. But that doesn't. There have been many years of case law that have further interpreted that, but it's still a facts and circumstances test, and many believe that manner of sale is also an important factor. So getting back to the SAFT white paper and why it was needed. So what people were saying is, hey, listen, we really want to sell to these folks that normally would be purchasing for investment. And how do we square this with the idea that we want our token not to be an investment contract? Because the Howey test tests for whether something is an investment contract under the securities laws, and hence a security. And so the SAFT white paper came up with a proposal, a framework, and said, hey, we've looked at this. Here's an idea. And the idea that was put forth, if anyone is listening and took part in this and this is not true, my apologies. But what was basically said was listen, you can say that this pre-sale, that this SAFT that this is an investment contract, and in fact, you can have the purchasers affirmatively say that they are buying for investment, and they are only buying for investment and to find a profit, and that they're not going to be buying for consumptive use. The idea being that, okay, you admit that this initial presale is a security, and that that's completely clear. It's actually made explicit. And then at some later point, when there is this moment when the token platform, the token achieve some sort of functionality, that then the essential efforts of the founders will have been expended, and then, okay, look, at the end of the day, if you do the analysis on your token, you can still have a token that is not a security, right? Because you're bifurcating something into two steps.
Right. And on the front end, I think it's accredited investors and people who would fall under regulatory exemptions, right?
That's correct. Exactly. So, yes. And so by the time you get to your larger token sale, that token can be home free, so to speak, or at least it's in a better position because for a variety of reasons, that it's ready to use, it's ready to go, you can really consume it right away. And I'm not going into all the nuances that were proposed,
right.
But in connection with that, there was actually a form of white paper that was attached. And that actually, the form of white paper is what I have a number of reservations about, in particular, holding aside the SAFT white paper and the rationale for a second.
Okay.
So I do have some concerns about the rationale as well. So what we were seeing in the market, and by the way, when this was announced, this SAFT white paper, it made a huge splash. Like, it definitely, people took notice. This was seen as, wow, this is a possible way forward. Unfortunately, however, some people understandably looking for certainty in a place where there is no certainty, and looking for black and white in a place where there is gray. Perhaps they didn't notice, or they didn't want to hear that the SAFT white paper was a proposal, and that form of SAFT was not intended to be the final last word on the subject. And instead, some of these people decided just to pretend or to assume that it was. And this can't, I must say, like, some token sellers and others, obviously, they may not have legal knowledge. They may not be lawyers, and so of course, if they see something, they may think, okay, I'll just follow this. At least I have a form now to use.
Right.
So one thing that was important was a number of us had some concerns about the form of SAFT white paper that was in the market and the SAFT white paper. So we thought that it was important to have those concerns put in a way that we could release and have a similar amount of of attention. Just to say, hey, look, remember, that was a proposal. Here are some concerns. Don't think that the concerns aren't there. Because I think it's important to remember that the creators of the SAFT white paper, they did not intend for people to be just relying on that, right. Especially not relying on it without counsel. They intended to start a discussion.
I spoke with Marco Santori earlier this week, actually, and he said, this is why we called it a project. Just to introduce, I know you know who he is. He's one of the lead authors from Cooley on this paper, and and he's been saying, like, I asked him about the feedback that they were getting, and he was like, it's great. It's exactly what we were looking for, and this is why we called it a project. It wasn't meant to be done. But as you're saying, I think a lot of people maybe looked at this and said, oh, great, we can get this, this is our legal rationale. We can take the form. We're good to go.
Right. And in fact, I had people coming to me saying, hey, Josh, like, you need to get smart on the SAFT. And I was like, wait a minute. When did you become a lawyer?
Right.
And so it was that was partly what prompted it. And I'll just say some of the concerns, certainly if people would like to take a look at it, it's available online. But some of the basic concerns were this. Holding aside some of the interpretations of case law, which I think if somebody's really curious, they could go read through and see where some differing views exist. At its very base, the idea that there are some kind of bright line rules that turn on anything, including functionality, that doesn't really work in the blockchain and token space anyway, because the idea of when something becomes functional, that's not even a bright line. So you're always going to be dealing in shades of gray. Also, the SEC has specifically said that the Howey test applies and that it's a facts and circumstances test. If they wanted to say it was a bright line test, they could have said it was a bright line test.
Right.
And there also is a risk that by following that form, which had the initial purchasers affirmatively stating that they were purchasing only for investment, the challenge with that is that, okay, it's one thing if you artificially try and bifurcate the transaction into two steps. One is a pre-sale, one is a regular sale. But in reality, it's still the same token that's being sold. And if you end up selling a material amount, or possibly even like in some cases a majority of tokens, if you're selling them in the pre-sale, and you as a token seller have affirmatively basically it's been spelled out that these people are purchasing for investment, and you have been selling it for investment purposes, you've been marketing it as an investment, then actually at the end of the day, when you get this token and the token is issued and the majority of people or a material amount of people are holding it because it was marketed as an investment, it's hard then to say, and this token is not an investment.
Right. It magically becomes just the coin in the arcade.
Right. Exactly. Because remember, like many believe that given case law that came after Howey, that manner of sale is very important. So if I go around saying, guess what, my token is going to appreciate by 1,300%, which I guess if you want to, we can touch on that case that was recently the SEC
enforcement action, right?
Yeah, but like if you're marketing something as a security, as an investment, then irrespective of the characteristics of the token and whether that in a vacuum would be not a security, you could end up with a security. And so, that manner of sale arguably has to be looked at with the SAFT as well. So I think that those are some of the concerns. Another concern that isn't really in the white paper, and I just want to back up for 1 second and say, I'm not saying that there is no way to do a compliant pre-sale or pre-order agreement. I mean, I think there are, just like you could do a pre-sale or pre-order of software. I just think it should be looking a lot more like a pre-sale or pre-order of software in some ways. And that if anything, you should either be silent about what the purpose of purchasing is, or you should say that you're purchasing for use, if that is in fact true, which hopefully may be. Again, there's a lot of case law in the SAFT white paper that I won't go into, but one thing that I do want to say that I think is important and this was not included in the form that was attached, which again was not supposed to be the end of the day, like the end of the end of the inquiry. I think it's very important that if you are going to do a pre-sale, pre-order theft, whatever you want to call it, whatever it looks like, that you have some kind of minimum description of what that token that person who's making that pre-sale purchase, what they're going to get. Because like including it either as an exhibit, it could be a very, just minimum characteristics, like it's an ERC20 token and it's going to provide you the ability to access as a member this ecosystem or do X and Y. Just minimums. That way, I think what there is the risk of happening is, say you enter into a pre-sale agreement with me, I'm the token seller, I get to my token sale, and then I end up giving you your token and you're like, this isn't what I ordered. This isn't what I wanted.
Right, yeah.
And you might say that for a variety of reasons. You might say that because it is in fact not what you thought you were getting. Or you may say it because, guess what, this token sale didn't go so well.
Right. And then you can say, this is not my idea. This is not what we talked about.
Yeah, I want my other tokens that I paid for this in. I want them back because they would have been more valuable to me now, even though you're not saying that, right? So by putting a description as either as an exhibit or something like that, ideally, if you have your full white paper done, then that's perfect. If that's in final form, I shouldn't say that's perfect. That would be preferable, right?
Right.
But if you cannot do that, at least having minimum characteristics, because otherwise, if you're in a legal dispute and it's very, very, very hard to prevent somebody from suing you, it would be really great if a finder of fact didn't have to go outside the four corners of the document to look at every email, to look at every, to consider every conversation or what was said after the signing of the document, etc. If you could somehow hardwire the minimum characteristics to what is somehow within the four corners of the pre-sale document, then yeah, you may not be able to prevent a fact finder, like meaning a judge or jury or something like that, from looking outside, or an arbitrator from looking outside of that document. But it's a good start.
Okay, right.
It's a good start.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I don't want to drone on about this. So if you have other
I want to ask,
questions.
I mean, this is a related question. You mentioned earlier how I guess the headlining topic for a lot of people, legal topic in this space is it a security? Is it not a security? When? How? But you mentioned there are other regulatory concerns and implications of token sales as well. And one of the ones that was brought up actually by an Allen & Overy lawyer, Connor O'Hanlon, he wrote a lengthy post about this earlier this week, I think, was about the CFTC, Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and their potential oversight over tokens, and when is a token a commodity. He had some particular views about how to kind of navigate those rules, but without getting too weedy in that, I mean, is that also an open question right now? Are these tokens commodities, and what does that mean?
Yes, I would say yes. That is the question, and I actually know Connor as well,
okay.
As well as Marco. So we're all kind of, I guess, playing in the same space. So yes, and I would frame it as this: for anyone who might be interested in selling tokens, you do not just need to consult one kind of lawyer. It's really a team approach. I'm sure that, or certainly in my firm, but I believe at least in my contemporaries at other law firms do a similar thing. It really needs to be a team approach to have analysis done with respect to commodities laws, tax laws, securities laws, investment company, investment advisor, broker-dealer, any number of financial services laws. If the token is in a particular industry, such as healthcare or insurance or something else that's regulated, you need to comply with those types of laws. There are really, it's a complex process, and it should be, because there are a lot of frameworks that are out there that you have to consider. So yes, definitely, the commodities question is a big one. Definitely, it has been said that Bitcoin is a commodity, and And I think there are certain questions as to whether certain other tokens may be commodities as well. So I didn't actually read Connor's piece, so I can't comment as to what he said, but I would say yes, you cannot forget about that. Also, to the extent you start getting into whether something might be a forward contract or an option or a swap, all kinds of things like that, the CFTC, may have jurisdiction over. And additionally, even just things like fraud, the CFTC may have jurisdiction over. So I think, and actually that leads kind of nicely into this enforcement action.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that.
And,
for people who didn't see the news earlier this week, and the SEC's new cyber unit announced its first enforcement action over an allegedly fraudulent ICO against the individuals behind it, who are in Canada actually. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
So in my view, this is exactly what the SEC should be focusing on. We should be very happy in the token sale community and legal community that this is being done. I think there's a lot of concern generally about, when you get into the gray area of whether something was a security or not, that maybe that's a tougher question to determine. But definitely, as I understand it, this particular token sale organizer had already been found in contempt of court in Quebec.
That's right, yeah.
For violating rulings that barred him and his colleagues from having a token sale in Quebec, or even, in fact, soliciting purchasers from Canada, because, as I understand it, there may have been some repeat activities here. So,
right. Yeah, he was characterized as a recidivist fraudster, I think.
Yeah, and in my view, though, we should be, okay, and by saying we, I really mean the token sale community.
Right.
I think that this should be embraced rather than feared, because enforcement actions against those who knowingly engage in scams or are willfully violating the law, that's good news for everyone. It's good news for token purchasers. It's good news for token sellers that are trying to comply with law, because then they don't have to compete against these fraudsters. So I think to the extent that we can dissuade people from engaging in outright fraud and scams, I think that's important. And if we can reduce the number or percentage of token sales that are fraudulent, then I think that's a very good thing. So,
got it. So Josh, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and then I know we're probably running up against the end of our time here, but is where you see some of the activity in this space. More specifically, there's been a lot of activity in Switzerland. Zug, Switzerland, has become or tried to make itself Crypto Valley. There's been not a few stories about this, and I wonder if you just see that as regulatory arbitrage, and that's something that will be temporary. Is this something that will persist? It's a little deeper than that. Is it going to pose a problem for regulators in the future? How do you see that space evolving?
Do you want me to limit that to just Switzerland or also other?
Yeah, I guess let's not. Other jurisdictions as well, because obviously Switzerland is not the only place, but that's the place that seems to be a hotbed of activity.
Yes, there certainly is a lot of activity in Switzerland. I also see a lot of forward thinking in, say, like Gibraltar and other places that have come out with guidance that suggests that they would like to be token sale launch jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. What I think is this: as more and more countries have spoken out about token sales and saying that under the laws of their jurisdictions, some of these may be securities or they may be whatever the local equivalent is, whether that's a collective investment scheme or something else. And as they've all basically said, we're concerned about at least those who have spoken out. We're concerned about fraud, we're concerned about scams, we're concerned about money laundering and terrorism financing, things like that. I think that there are less opportunities for regulatory arbitrage because these various jurisdictions want to protect their citizens, right? They may care less about they I'm sure care less about other people who are not within their who are not their
right, not
citizens.
Their responsibility, right?
Exactly. So I do think this, so like if the U.S. is going to be a target market for you, if you are a token seller and it's really important to you that you sell into the U.S., then U.S. securities laws are going to apply to you. Other laws in the U.S. are going to apply to you as well.
Right.
So you need to be mindful of them. Now, whether that means that you're going to limit it to only accredited investors and all of the other things that come into play under, exemptions under Reg D, or whether you want to do a fully registered offering if it is a token sale that is securities, or whether you're taking the position that you're not selling a security. I mean, you just have to be mindful of the laws in the U.S. Now, I suppose one benefit to doing something overseas is if you want to exclude the U.S., right, and you have an effective way of excluding U.S. persons and preventing U.S. persons from purchasing tokens, or from getting a hold of them in any other way or something like that, then yes, I guess in that sense you may decide that you want to go abroad. I will say this though, to the extent, a lot of what was done previously in the past year, before this guidance came out from various countries, was people thought, okay, I can go to this jurisdiction because they don't think that a token is a security.
Right.
And that may have been based on something, some interpretation, on some case or something like that, and now there have been clarifications in some of those jurisdictions, including Switzerland, where they say, some of these may be securities.
Right.
So I think the Dow case made clear that wherever in the world you are, if you're marketing, issuing, or selling to U.S. persons, you have to care about U.S. securities laws. But the other thing that often takes people outside of the U.S. in terms of structuring, just generally for commercial transactions, and this isn't a good thing or a bad thing, right, is tax considerations.
Sure.
So I think tax usually is a big driver in terms of where you want to sell from. Now, if you're a U.S. person, and again, as I said in the beginning, I am not a tax lawyer, and
right.
Also none of this was legal advice anyway, but I'll put it this way, it's very hard if you're a U.S. person to get away from U.S. tax laws.
Right.
So query whether there is an advantage that way. Really, you should seek counsel for that. But yeah, I think we will see less and less regulatory arbitrage. But then again, if you are comfortable and you have an adequate way of cutting off the U.S. and that works with your business plan as well, then perhaps you may decide to go overseas to launch. And I shouldn't say overseas because there could be people from outside the U.S. hearing this. I just mean outside the U.S.
Right. Well, Josh Klayman, thanks so much for taking time to speak with me today. I really appreciated all this. This is a fascinating issue. We'll have to stay tuned.
Oh, my pleasure, Ben.
That's our podcast. If you liked the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. You can reach me on Twitter at BenGHancock. Tune in again in 2 weeks for another episode of Unprecedented, and in the meantime, check law.com for the latest legal news. I'm Ben Hancock. Thanks for listening.